Yeah, let's get started. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining us. Sorry for the technical issues in the beginning, but thank you all for coming. I just wanted to thank Carnivorous Plant Nursery and Michael Sezzi for giving us our door prize. So we're raffling off 2 sets of 6 Sarracenia rhizomes, and Anna's going to be, or Blake's going to be doing that at the end of our meeting. So a couple of you have asked whether we'll have more in-person meetings in the future. We'll definitely be doing that, but I'm sure as you're following national news, the situation with COVID hasn't quite been under control yet. So we'll have to wait a little bit longer to see whether we can do an in-person meeting this year, but hopefully, fingers crossed, we could. A couple of you have also been asking about membership. So joining us, membership, because this year a lot of our events will be virtual, we're going to extend membership all the way until December 31st of 2022. So you'll get 2 years of membership. Actually, would someone mind passing me over a screen share so I can actually share my screen?
You got it.
Awesome, thanks. So if I'll just share my screen very quickly.
And Kevin, you'll have to admit people as they come in too. So just.
Sure. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Yes.
Awesome. So this is our website. If you go to more and then join us, you'll find a link for membership. So the top form is a way for you to contact us. Just send us an email. But at the bottom, you see information about membership. And so membership has a bunch of different benefits. We have auctions. You'll be able to participate as a seller in the auction. You'll get a 10% discount at Carnivorous Plant Nursery. There'll be subsidies when applicable on field trips and things like that. And we have a couple of membership packages. So individualship would be a year, family year, and then student is $5 a year. And to apply for membership, what you'll want to do is fill out a form. It's linked over here. So it'll bring you to this Google form. Just go and fill it out. And then also choose the appropriate membership that you want, and then send us a PayPal for that. So we'll review the payment, we'll review the form, and then in a couple of days, we'll send you a notification letting you know that your membership was approved. So that's all it is for membership. If you have any questions, feel free to shout them out or just type them in the chat, and we'll get to you about membership. But in addition, so I just wanted to let you know that our next meeting is going to be July 17th. So very easy, just in 3 more months. And we'll send out more information about that as well once we have it. So with that, let us begin a carnivorous plant question and answer session. So a bunch of you have already sent in some questions beforehand, but if you have any questions now, feel free to unmute yourself, shout them out, and Blake's also going to help us by reading questions in the chat. Thanks.
All right, so our first question is, do you have any guidance on sprayers or misters for carnivorous plants in indoor terrariums?
I personally don't spray or mist any of my plants. Usually if they're in a terrarium, it's pretty humid to begin with. So I find that spraying can lead to some mold and issues like that. So I prefer just to water as normal, and I just personally skip spraying.
I have a Mist King in one of my terrariums, and I'm definitely not an expert on it. I'm kind of still trying to like figure out how to keep the humidity at the level that I want without it being like too wet. But it definitely works well, and like the price was pretty reasonable if you want a mister. And you can also like use it for multiple terrariums if they're close to each other by getting a splitter. So if you want a mister, I definitely recommend that. It was maybe like $100 or $120 for it, and it's worked pretty well. It was pretty easy to set up. All right, our next question. What is a good beginner plant that can overwinter outside in Pennsylvania?
Sarracenia purpurea. There's a number of native sundews to the northeast as well.
Keepers Wayne and
Yep.
entered into a friendly competition as to who can catch the most.
Kevin, if you could pass me back the host.
Sure. Yep.
All right. What advice do you have regarding cephalotus cultivation?
Just let them catch. They need it for practice.
I can answer that.
But the island has
Oh, I'm muted. I could answer that one. So I grow a lot of cephalotus, but I found it actually to be relatively easy to grow as long as you give them a very stable environment. So the soil mix is the same that I would use for Sarracenia or fly traps. Basically, it's a mix of peat and sand or peat and perlite, whatever I have on hand at the time. Very bright lights. Watering is with the tray method, distilled water, and then basically don't touch them. So if you're gonna repot them, do so sparingly. Generally, what I'll do is I'll actually kind of either break the pot or just lift the whole plant up out of the pot and then plant it. So trying to disturb the roots as little as possible. Other than that, it takes a lot of patience, but they do grow out, and it's very satisfying to see them fill a pot.
Will there be another carnivorous plant auction again this year? I'm looking for new homes for some of my pitcher plants and fly traps and would love to help support MACPS.
We'd really like to. The board will talk about it. Maybe we can do some kind of virtual auction again later this year, or if the pandemic decides to die down, then we'll have hopefully one in person. We'll definitely keep you updated, and we're always trying to get more of these, interactive events, auctions going for you guys.
We have a question in the chat. Any tips for growing ones in rocks? I recently got one from Redleaf, and it's the only one I've gotten in a stone rock media. I think he's referring to cephalotus.
I am indeed.
Yeah.
I have not grown cephalotus in like pumice. So pumice will work for I think pinguicula. I'd be curious to see. I mean, I think it could probably work, but cephalotus has relatively deeper roots. And so I don't know what your rock looks like, but try it.
And then we already addressed this question about having more. Oh, will there be more in-person meetings in New Jersey in the future?
So back when we had in-person meetings, we tried to reach all the different sectors of our population, whether that was Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, even Virginia, West Virginia. So we'll definitely try to have a meeting in New Jersey. It's one of our more popular locations anyway. So I'm sure you'll, see a meeting there in a couple of months, hopefully.
And those are all of the questions I see. If anybody else in the meeting has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or if you want to type it in the chat.
Any recommendations for grow tents that people particularly enjoy? Looking for maybe a medium to large sized grow tent?
I love my tent. Let me figure out what brand it is real quick.
Yeah, Jamie, while you're figuring out yours, I just pulled mine up. So I have a huge one, actually. It's a 24 by 48 inch by 84 inch tall, ultra yield 1680 Mylar professional indoor growing tent. That's the one I use. So it's really tall. I live in an apartment, and it's just nice to have that vertical space. But it's got kind of vents. It's got this big like hole in the top right where I can put wires through, or for lights. I like it.
My tent is not quite as large as Kevin's, but it is big enough. It is the VioSun 96 by 48 by 72 indoor grow tent. And I have one that's got a cubed roof because mine goes underneath a HVAC vent, or not the tubing. But I really like it. It has a waterproof liner in the bottom, and it's reflective, and just like Kevin's, it has the ports so you can put ventilation in and you can pass wires through and stuff. I really, really like that one. I had one of the kind of crappy clear ones before, and this was a massive upgrade. It's in my basement, which is usually around 65, 70 degrees, and it keeps it about 10 to 15 degrees warmer in there just from the ambient heat from the lights and the, humidity from the plants. So I would definitely recommend that one.
Thank you guys so much. Would you actually mind sending those specs and names in the chat? Because I didn't quite catch them both.
Yeah, so I just put the Amazon link to it.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
All right, we have a few more questions in the chat. My fly traps look mangled and distorted coming out of dormancy. Should I worry? Is it a virus or the like?
John, you want to show us or send us a picture? Maybe the collective minds here can take a look.
I should have brought it inside, but I'd have to run outside to find it. But the traps just look really exactly that distorted. Like maybe, I mean, I was worried it might be a virus. Maybe it's just something fly traps do. It's not something I've seen before. It's hit several of the plants. The traps are all kind of twisted around. They don't look like they would close. I don't know.
I mean, what you're describing reminds me of thrips.
Okay.
Is that I've had that issue with my Sarracenia, but I've never had that with fly traps.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say also maybe aphids, but it's hard
Or
to tell without a
aphids.
picture. If you post one on the Facebook group, maybe people can take a look and then comment on it.
Yeah, I'll do that because I guess I got to actually see it.
Anybody have overwintering tips for southwestern Pennsylvania? I lost a lot of plants to dormancy this year. I kept them in an unheated garage and they did not fare well. Are there tips for keeping them outdoors? I have Sarracenia, fly traps, and Darlingtonia.
So a big issue with overwintering in the Northeast specifically is not necessarily that the plants get too cold because they tolerate freezes pretty well. The issue is repeated freeze-thaw cycles. So if you're in zones like say 7B or colder, you're probably going to want to mulch your temperate plants pretty heavily so that they stay frozen when temperatures drop below freezing at night regularly. Otherwise, if they're just sitting out in an unheated garage or outside, they're going to repeatedly freeze thaw, and that's going to destroy the rhizomes.
Yeah, I see that someone posted in the chat, big plastic containers and lots of long pine needles. That is exactly what I do, and it works remarkably well. Just those gigantic Rubbermaids, you load them up with like 6 to 8 inches of pine needles. You even kind of worry that they're not getting any light or that nothing's going through, but they're really fine. I think the key thing is to make sure that they're not too wet if you do that, because if they get too wet, then you could have problems with rotting and things like that. But, I just put them under in, I think, November, and then I never watered them, just let them do their own thing outside. And then a couple of weeks ago, I took them out and they all made it. Let's try that out.
I didn't trim my Sarracenia during the winter. Is it too late to do that? They are in a bog garden outdoors. I mean, I know I just trimmed mine.
I didn't trim mine until this weekend. So
yeah, I didn't trim mine, and I don't know if it would have been better to do it in the fall, but I didn't do it in the fall, so I just did it now.
I like to do it in the fall because it helps prevent getting lots of insects who are sitting there eating the detritus in the spring. So that's the benefit of having it done in the fall, is less things like thrips and aphids. It doesn't completely prevent it, but it does help. But I just was lazy this year and it didn't happen.
Any tips for aphids, etc.? They keep migrating around my sundews and possibly my cephalotus.
Indoors or outdoors?
outdoors. Um,
So for outdoors, I'm going to recommend a product that maybe not all of you will like, but I've used orthene in the past. It is an organophosphate pesticide. I definitely would not recommend using it on anything that you plan to eat, anything, any vegetables nearby. I grow vegetables organically. That stuff doesn't even touch the vegetables I grow, but it is remarkably effective. So you spray it once and then all the aphids go away. If you kind of miss a little bit, then you just spray over a second time, maybe in 2 weeks. That works remarkably well. People have suggested things like ladybugs. That's a great solution if you're outdoors, but also you're growing carnivorous plants. So maybe not so much of a great idea. If you are talking about like an individual localized infection, one thing that people can do is just submerge the plants underwater for like a day. And that has been reported to help with aphids.
I'm sorry, I meant indoor. I apologize. I have some Cape sundews that are just, they keep coming back from the rootstock, and I've been using neem, alternately neem or pyrethrins.
Those will work if you, I think, keep at it. You have to use them pretty consistently, and they're definitely safer than orthene. But I mean, if you should try the orthene. I think you can buy it on Amazon. It also comes as like fire ant killer or something maybe. But if you want to do that indoors, I'd suggest you put the plant in a bag and then seal it up, spray it, and then take it outside after a week or so, and then that'll probably solve your problem. I've done that in the past with my indoor plants.
Thank you.
And I think that is the end of our questions.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I have a Sarracenia leucophila tarnock that I've had for over a decade, and the rhizome is just huge, but the pictures are getting smaller and smaller every year. I was wondering, if I divide up the rhizome, do you think that might help me get bigger pictures?
Yeah, if the rhizome is alive, also nice backdrop over there. But if the rhizome is alive, so if you cut into it, right, and you see the nice kind of white, like fleshy rhizome as opposed to like a dead brown one, I think that will definitely work. So, when you're dividing, I'm sure but you have a bunch of nodes, right? So just make sure that each section of rhizome has at least one node planted and see what happens. I do think that over time, big rhizomes tend to get stale. That's also my experience as well. And so I've had success chopping it up and just doing things like that.
Cool, thank you.
Asking questions.
Well,
I think we are.
Does anybody else have any questions they want to ask? Please feel free to speak up if you do. Okay, I think then if nobody has any other questions, we can move on to the next part of our meeting. So Alvin, if you want to go ahead and introduce our speakers for the meeting.
Sure, I'd be glad to. So we have a really interesting talk lined up for today. Our guest speakers, Alexander Dietrick and Fernando Rivadavia, have spent probably countless hours in the field documenting Drosera and Utricularia all over the world. Some of you may be familiar with Fernando's very substantial publishing on carnivorous plant taxonomy. Alex and Fernando recently returned from a botanical expedition in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where they made quite a few exciting discoveries that we'll be lucky enough to hear about today, including a new species of Drosera. So without further ado, take it away, Alex and Fernando.
Hey guys, let me figure out, can somebody let me share my screen so I can switch over? Okay, cool.
Should be good to go.
Right. Okay, Fernando will be popping in and out. I know he ran off for a second here, but I'll go ahead and get started. So this talk is, like Alvin said, covering our recent trip to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where our main goal was to rediscover a lost species of Drosera, Drosera catongensis. I first got interested in this species during my senior year of college. I did some climate modeling for South African Drosera. I grew carnivorous plants as a kid, was in the carnivorous plant listserv in the 90s, but I really didn't grow them again until college when I started the climate change in South Africa research project that I was working on. I picked Drosera because they were easy to identify. A lot of people hiking on the trails in South Africa would stop and take pictures of them. They're very charismatic. And I had just a wealth of data at my fingertips from citizen science projects, especially on iNaturalist. And so that's what really got my teeth hooked into African Drosera. And so one of the most interesting species for me of the African Drosera was this Drosera catongensis, because it was the only one on the continent for which photos didn't exist. And so where there's a gap of information there, I just kind of got obsessive about this species and made it a big goal of mine to go get the first photos of it. And so what we know about Drosera catongensis, all we really knew was from herbarium specimens. And so here's a selection of herbarium specimens. The type specimens, which are the original collections, are here, just a handful of specimens. And a lot of specimens that were labeled Drosera catongensis, which the further I got into the taxonomy and morphology of this species, I realized that a lot of these specimens were mislabeled. They weren't actually Drosera catongensis. And so we have some mislabeled specimens here. These ones are mostly Drosera elongata, as well as Drosera madagascariensis. The problem with ensis names, which denotes a place, is that somebody might find a sundew in Katanga and assume that it's actually catongensis, but we have a handful of species in that province. And so what do we know about Drosera catongensis from these really old specimens? This species was first collected in 1912 by Amblay and was formally described by Taton in 1945. We have an original location on the Biano Plateau where it was growing in a humid savanna, as well as some flower morphology notes, even though there's no flowers on these specimens. So not much information. We see some new growth emerging from old stems, which suggests that these are seasonally growing plants. So maybe they emerge in a wet season after a prolonged dry season, or perhaps after a fire. They have erect scapes, which differentiates them from Drosera madagascariensis, which has curved scapes here, and really pubescent all parts of the plant. So pubescent stems here, pubescent scape, petioles, just a really hairy plant. And I love this part of this herbarium specimen. There's a caterpillar, which is most likely feeding on the captured insects rather than engaging in herbivory. And so I started planning this trip. I started planning this trip in 2018. I was talking to a professor at the University of Lubumbashi in the Democratic Republic of Congo about his own work and his own field work on Kundalungu Plateau. where he studies parasitic plants. And I just started talking logistics, permits, networking with people over there through email. The plant has been collected from the Kundalungu Plateau in this area here, and the Biano Plateau, as well as the Kabara Plateau. There's 5 high altitude plateaus in the Katanga region of the Democratic Republic of Congo, the highest being the Marungu Plateau and the lowest in altitude being the Manika Plateau. And so we plan to visit these 4, the Kundalungu, the Manika, the Biano, and the Kabara. And so I landed in the Democratic Republic of the Congo a few days earlier than Fernando. Unfortunately, this trip, the way it was planned out, happened in the middle of the pandemic. And so we had the worst time just getting to this country, and Fernando was delayed by several days. So I waited for him around town. I made it to a little field research herbarium to try to check out their Drosera collection that hasn't been digitized. So here's me in front of the herbarium. This was a really unusual herbarium. It was pretty much open air, so exposed to all the elements, humidity. The specimens were in really sad shape, lots of mold, but it was really amazing to be able to go and see these incredibly old specimens in this herbarium. So here's Utricularia pentadactyla, which is a rare annual Utricularia species from tropical Africa. And so I was able to digitize some of these specimens so that we can preserve that data in the event that these plants are lost, or these specimens are lost. Fernando made it a few days later without his bags. Then we had to wait another couple days for his bags. But we were able to get on the road there and start the permit process. So this is just a glimpse of the neighborhood where we were staying, just a really bustling community, a lot different from the United States in the middle of the pandemic, where things were kind of more restricted. This is us at the University of Lubumbashi. We had to stop there to organize our permits for collecting. Here's us at the University of Lubumbashi Herbarium with Dr. Eduardo Ilunga. And our permits that took me so long to get, and I was super pleased that we were actually able to get these, that allowed us to collect in Kundalungu National Park as well as Opemba National Park. And this is the director of parks there, and our guide, Christian, who was immense help in this. And so we stocked up on supplies. These are some of my favorite selections from the Congolese grocery store, Choco clams and Sugar Daddy brand of sugar. And Fernando.
Sorry to interrupt, but someone's waiting to be let in. Do you mind just letting them into the meeting?
Oh, me? Yeah, let's see.
Sorry.
No, you're good. I didn't know that was me. Hold on. Okay, got it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so here's Fernando with our fully stocked Land Cruiser. And just a glimpse of what the communities were like that we were driving through. So it was really amazing to see all these hand-painted signs on all the storefronts, all these hand-painted murals of vegetables on the produce stores. All of the butcher shops had hand-painted murals of meat and animals. It was just really awesome to see. And this was our first campsite of the night, so that we set off to the type location of Drosera katongensis first, because we wanted to see plants that were most similar to the original collection that Humble had made on the Biano Plateau. And so we set camp here in this, this pretty wet savanna. And our first African sunset for this trip. And not too far from the site, we found our first carnivorous plants of this trip. So this is Genlissia subglabra, which is a really cool terrestrial carnivorous plant of the family Lentibulariaceae. So in the same family as the Utricularia, the bladderworts. It has subterranean traps that microorganisms enter, and I think the common name is like the lobster trap plant. So they enter through these modified leaves and get trapped in these kind of funnel shaped traps that hairs allow them to not leave. And there was really cool, a blue form of this plant too. So a little bit of variation. So blue flowers, the more common purple flowers for this plant. If you are familiar with Fernando's field reports, he is, in my mind, famous for his bouquets of carnivorous plants. So here's him with a fistful of Genlissia subglabra flowers. Their leaves are kind of nondescript, so small circular leaves, really similar to Utricularia, that are probably more commonly grown and familiar with. And we were really surprised to see this white flowered form as well. So this one seemed to lack any kind of pigments. This is our guide Christian, and this is Fernando busily pressing away herbarium specimens for these plants. Carnivorous plants haven't been collected in the Congo since the 60s, so we made it a huge point to collect as many herbarium specimens as we can, so we can kind of capture this moment in time as far as the assemblage of carnivorous plant species in these places. At this site, we also saw Drosera madagascariensis, which I was really excited to see. This was a species I hadn't seen elsewhere in Africa. A little bit of variation. So some smaller plants that were more exposed to the sun were growing smaller and redder. And this was a species that was always in really wet areas. You can see some sphagnum moss as well, and some Eriocoliaceae. At this site, we also saw Utricularia appendiculata, which is an unusual species. It climbs these tall grasses and gets its flowers above the grasses. It's a really unusual species. It's placed in its own section, most closely aligned to section Filaria of Utricularia. So like Utricularia striatula, any of these weird annuals, that's its closest relative. There are other species of Utricularia that twine around grasses like this, but interestingly, and this might be only interesting to me, but this one twines in the opposite direction of the other twining Utricularia. So I think it's counterclockwise instead of clockwise, which is unusual. And really pretty little flowers that kind of remind me of popcorn. They're white and yellow and kind of round. Our guide was particularly fond of them. He would hear him. We all kind of split up as we're looking for these plants to cover as much ground, and we would hear our guide Christian shouting appendiculata from like quarter mile away. He was a really great guide in that he learned these plant names really quickly. We were so impressed and really happy with him. He was a great help. A little bit of variation. This one's a little more yellow than some of the other ones we saw. We also saw Drosera flexicalis at this site, which is a really unusual species of Drosera in that it's stem forming, but it also forms these rosettes at the end and sometimes along its stem. Fernando and Andreas saw this species in Zambia on previous trips. And in Zambia, we're thinking that there wasn't as much of a seasonality because they saw these rosettes along the stems. In Congo, we only saw them terminally. And we saw them as they breached the canopy of these grasses. So we're thinking while these plants are growing, they're shooting up these grasses, trying to get to the light. And then once they reach that light, they're growing a lot more compact. And so lots of interesting adaptations to cope with these tall grasses that these carnivorous plants are growing with in tropical Africa. So here's some in the climbing stage, and you see this a lot in young plants and plants that haven't reached the canopy there. And this species was the most abundant Drosera on this trip. We saw thousands of it. It was just a really common species. It was really predictable where we might find it. It was in the wetter hillsides in all of these grassy savannas here. Here you can see these terminal rosettes. We also saw Utricularia pubescens, which is a cool species in that its distribution includes tropical Latin America as well as tropical Africa. So a big disjunct distribution there. And it has these really characteristic circular leaves that are covered in a kind of mucilage. We also saw one of my personal favorites, Utricularia subulata, which is another species with a huge distribution. And we're still in the Biano Plateau here. We saw this species as well, which we're thinking is Drosera pilosa, known for its short and really pubescent scapes. This was a species, as we dug them up, we found really long tap roots. So we're thinking this species goes through a kind of dormancy in the dry season and emerges in the wet season, which was the season we were there for. And this species is really closely related to Drosera dielziana from South Africa and Zimbabwe. We didn't find Drosera catongensis at the type location. Unfortunately, we never made it exactly to the type location. There was a big mining concession that had blocked our entry, and so we weren't able to explore any further on the Biano Plateau. So we moved on to the Kibara Plateau, which was partly in Upemba National Park, and it was a lot higher of elevation, so just by about 200 meters in elevation higher. On our ascent there, we found these really cool non-carnivorous plants, but these are Xerophytica, which are in the family of Velosiaceae, another pantropical family there. Fire adapted, so you can see these charred stems. All these areas get a lot of fire in the dry season, and so these plants are strongly fire adapted. And our first big animal sighting. So unfortunately, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and especially the Katanga region, doesn't have a lot of its large fauna left. They've mostly been poached out, but we were really surprised to see part of the Congo's only herd of zebra in Upemba National Park. Not a very common sight when you're looking for Drosera or any other carnivorous plants. More Drosera pilosa on this plateau. Sometimes growing a little bit wetter, and so a little bit larger when it was wetter. And then we were really surprised to find, more so than any other species on this trip, this new species of Drosera. So this was our second species of Drosera in Pemba National Park. And it was just a really awesome looking plant. We had huge rosettes, and we hadn't seen this one in herbarium specimens before. So it's a total surprise. I'm gonna go back to that last picture here, but really large sepals. Semi-erect leaves that are a really extreme, like a hammerhead shape. So a really unique shape for a Drosera to have. So I'm really excited. Even though this is like an ugly green Drosera, at least it has a really cool leaf shape here. And it grew in fairly dry, really sandy patches of the savanna that were a little more open, so not as densely packed with those tall grasses we were finding in other parts of the savanna. And we only found 2 small populations of it, so these were highly localized. We were happy to find just 1 open flower. So part of any good species description is you need to be able to describe the floral parts. So we were happy to find this. So undivided styles here, and just these really crazy, huge sepals. Another Drosera species we were excited to see on the Kabara Plateau was this undescribed species of Drosera. This one we had known about for quite some time. Andreas and Fernando found this species in Zambia as well. And it's been recorded from Angola, Tanzania, but there had been no records from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we're happy to add this country to its range. I think the description for this species is coming out pretty soon. So just in time for us to add this range extension. And then after a few days of searching, we were super excited to find our main target for this trip, or at least my main target was Drosera katongensis. So the first photos of Drosera katongensis we got to take here on the Kabara Plateau. It's a closely related species to Drosera elongata, Drosera madagascariensis, the rest of the stem-forming tropical African sundews. We found it growing just in 1 location on this plateau. So it was in this hillside seepage, which seemed to be the pretty common habitat for all of the other Drosera. So always on a hillside where there was some amount of running water, kind of a seep here. And so in this location, the seep was flowing over some rocks here. In the parks, we were always accompanied by armed guards in the event that we would come into contact with poachers, but we didn't have any kind of problems. And we were happy to find these guys in flower. And so we can see these characteristic erect scapes covered in hair, really hairy plants. Just a really handsome species. Just densely pubescent. This bract here that's also evident in the type specimens. And something really cool, that type specimen that I mentioned that had the caterpillar on it, that was stealing prey. We also found a really similar caterpillar on these plants as well, which was really fun. Especially since I had been staring at that type specimen with that caterpillar for years. To see it just mirrored in the live specimens was a really cool treat. something really unique about this species is its gradual transition from the lamina to the petiole. So it has these kind of flattened, widened petioles here that we don't find in other stem forming species.
Alex, don't forget to mention the dead stems in the previous picture.
Yeah, I think I have a better picture of it, but yeah, totally. Yeah, there we go. So we were able to see that these plants were in fact exhibiting seasonal growth. So there's a lot of old stems from the older plants here that I didn't even see when I was in the field. It wasn't until after I got back that I saw all these old stems on these plants at this location. On this plateau, we also saw Drosera flexicalis, Drosera madagascariensis, Drosera madagascariensis, a bit larger, redder plants than what we saw on the Kabar or on the Biano Plateau. Growing in a really unique sphagnum bog. So it's not the kind of habitat we expected to find in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but was an awesome surprise. And Drosera madagascariensis was just always growing super wet. Here it is growing right in the water with some flooded sphagnum. Growing with a Utricularia species, Utricularia prehensilis. This is another species that twines around the vegetation when it has to, but here in the open, it's not twining, it's growing a little more compact. In fact, we were confusing it with a closely related species, Utricularia andongensis, for a while, just because it was growing so compact and not twining, which would we be expecting for prehensilis. This is my favorite picture, Fernando, waist deep in the sphagnum bog, which was not necessary, as all these plants were growing on the margin of this bog as well. This was exclusively for the shits of it that he had to get in here.
Oh, the best specimens were in the middle. Come on.
We also found Utricularis cymbantha in this bog, which is a small aquatic species that I wish I would have gotten better pictures of, or any pictures of, but not in flower, unfortunately.
It's not like I enjoy walking in ice cold water, right? I mean,
and really cool plants associated with all these carnivorous plants. So Papalanthus, Eriocolin, Signiganthus, all these Eriocolinaceae that were really cool to see in this habitat. And so we left the Kabara Plateau, headed to the Kundalungu Plateau, and had our first major hiccup of this trip when our Land Cruiser here made it into this ditch. So here's everybody assessing the situation. And it took a literal village to get us out of that ditch here. So at one point we had cut off the seat belts of the Land Cruiser and tied them to this guy who was driving by. Seatbelts snapped, seatbelts were too old. Eventually it was our luggage tie-down straps that had worked, that we had tied to this other car. We had taken all of our stuff out to lighten the load, but I think we were only stuck there for maybe an hour or so.
That was a little bit more than that.
Yeah. Could have been longer.
We're having fun.
Yeah. And we found some Drosera at that site. We actually found a Drosera pilosa growing just by the roadside there.
Yeah, those were the first we saw with flowerscapes, which pretty much confirmed that it was pilosa, because until that point, we hadn't seen any flowerscapes.
Mm-hmm. some more glimpses of town. I took a lot of pictures of these murals. I was completely blown away by it. Just really awesome craftsmanship there. Really.
Did you freeze?
What was that?
Did you freeze there? You said, I don't know if it was just me, but it sounded like you froze for a second.
Industry, which is a big threat to the Miombo forests, which are the primary ecosystems aside from the Miombo forests are burned to collect the charcoal, and the charcoals fuel everything from cooking, heating water for showers. So it's the primary fuel source there. A pretty typical way of transportation here on the roads. We'd see people hitching rides on everything from pickup trucks to oil tankers over here. So it was pretty crazy to see just how many people they could fit on the tops of these vehicles. Motorbikes were a big common way of transportation. And just to see the immense loads that they were carrying on these bikes was pretty crazy to see. And this was the Kundalungu Plateau. So just a huge, immense highland savanna that we would see on these plateaus. So these plateaus were about 1,900 meters in elevation, 1,700 to 1,900 meters. So the tree growth was concentrated around these small streams that were the sources of larger rivers off the plateaus. So they kind of formed these gallery forests along the streams. Here's one of those gallery forests in a hillside where we often found carnivorous plants. So the water would run down these hillsides and collect where these gallery forests were. And this is one of the first carnivorous plants we found on the Kundalungu Plateau. So Fernando's personal favorite, I think, Utricularia reflexa, which has these insanely huge traps for Utricularia. You could literally see the prey inside of them, all kinds of Daphnia and ostracods and copiopods or whatever kind of small crustaceans that were in these traps. Apparently not as large as the ones in Zambia, but still just really impressive plants. I think the ones from Zambia are available in cultivation. So it's just a really cool, impressive aquatic Utricularia if you want to try to grow one. And we found them in these seasonally flooded areas. So we think that they survive the dry season as kind of a dried up turian, like the temperate species do.
Or maybe just seeds, who knows, could be annuals.
Yeah. This is our campsite on Kundalungu. And so it's a pretty remote park. So the park rangers live on site with their families. We found a huge abundance of that new species from Zambia, which doesn't have a name yet, but it has these green rosettes closely related to Madagascariensis, elongata, all those species as far as the floral characters go. But it doesn't form a stem. In the areas where it got the most light, it got kind of a blushed orangey color and more semi-erect leaves, but mostly it was shaded by vegetation. And this was probably the most abundant plant on Kundalungu as far as Drosera goes. We also found more Utricularia subulata, Drosera burkiana, which we hadn't seen elsewhere. This is a annual species, at least in this area. So we found it just just in a few places that may have been more permanently wet.
And this was a big surprise for me, since in Zambia, it was probably the most common species everywhere, but I was at a different time of year in Zambia. So this is the only sundew that we saw in the Congo that seemed to grow as an annual. All the other ones seemed to die down to the roots and survive that way throughout the dry season.
We also found more Genlissia subglabra. These ones with a lot longer of a spur here. More Utricularia pubescens. And a annual species of Utricularia, Utricularia welwitschii, that's pretty widespread in Africa. We weren't at the right time of the year to see a lot of these annual species, but we had found a couple populations of this species on Kundalungu Plateau that were more permanently wet and hadn't burned. This is Utricularia prehensilis. And this was a pretty cool habitat we would see on Kundalungu. So all this sphagnum moss, this kind of seepage bog where the water would collect, and just a huge amount of species here. We would find the Genlissia, Drosera madagascariensis, Drosera flexicalis in these bogs. Genlissia africana, which was a species we hadn't seen elsewhere. Like Utricularia welwitschii, this is an annual species, so we only saw it in a few places where it was more permanently wet and it hadn't burned recently. So here's the rosettes of Genlissia africana. And Genlissia subglabra, so just these huge rosettes of circular leaves. We were hoping to see a couple other Genlissia species on this trip, namely Genlissia angolensis and Genlissia pallida. Photos don't exist of Genlissia pallida, so this was a big goal, but we unfortunately weren't able to find it where it had been previously recorded. Genlissia subglabra, again, that really cool blue form that we found on this plateau as well. And it would just form these really awesome carpets of these circular leaves on this really peaty soil. Blue form and the purple form. And then I'll let Fernando talk about this photo.
Yeah, at first notice, you think they're all Genlissia, but then you look carefully on the left, the two leftmost flowers. That's not a Genlissia. That's a stupid little damn plant that reminded us a lot of Genlissia. When you see it, especially from far away, you think, ah, crap. In fact, at one point, the first time I saw it, I did scream out to Alex, you know, Genlissia, come over. And it grew in similar habitats, and I'm sure they're pollinated by the same insect. They are very similar, but unfortunately not a Genlissia. And it was, yeah, pain in the butt to have keep stumbling across these plants and keep thinking it was Genlissia all the time.
This is Drosera flexicalis again on this Kundalungu plateau. Pretty typical habitat, so tall grasses where it had adapted to climb those grasses in a wetter area. Then we saw a couple other of those species. And we were super excited to see this species on the left here, Drosera elongata, which has these really hairy scapes, really similar to Drosera catongensis and Drosera madagascariensis at times in appearance. So we were calling this hairy madagascariensis for a while, maybe the first hour that we saw this plant, because when you think of Drosera elongata, there's so few photos and so few herbarium specimens of this plant. In fact, Fernando and Andreas had taken the only other photos of this plant when they saw it in Zambia. And it usually just has these really long stems from which it gets its name. And so we saw it at a different time of the year where it was just emerging from the roots after the dry season. And so we didn't immediately connect it to that species. There's a park ranger carrying this species, and you can see these just super long inflorescences that were pretty typical of most of the species here in the savannas. They're getting these flowers above the grasses for pollination and maybe dispersal as well. Drosera elongata. And you can see it's a lot of these plants are just emerging after a fire. These ones
we're extremely early in the wet season, right? So a lot of these plants are not just emerging, but I think we missed tons of annual species that if we had gone a few months later, we might have seen a lot of annual Dietricks and who knows, maybe some other ones.
Totally. Here's Drosera elongata growing with Utricularia subulata. And Drosera elongata has this really characteristic pubescent scape. And on this plateau, we also found quite a few populations of Drosera catongensis again. So I was really happy that my last catongensis weren't my first. So we found this one in abundance. So we had a hunch that on the Kabara Plateau that we weren't seeing prime habitat for this species. We only found one small population, not in any kind of numbers that we had seen other species. And on the Kundalungu Plateau, we were able to get a better feel for what this plant finds in a proper habitat. So it was mostly growing on these mounds of grass here, these tussock grasses, where there wasn't any competition for vegetation. These plants aren't getting as tall, at least in any of the herbarium specimens or any of the plants we saw, as some of the other stem-forming species like Drosera flexicalis. So it might be that they're specializing on these exposed mounds of grasses to avoid competition. And so it was pretty predictable where we'd find them. We'd look for these tussock grasses and we would pull apart the grasses and usually find these plants here. And so we found them by the hundreds on this plateau. It was pretty amazing.
Very unique habitat. It was very odd. I don't think I've ever seen a species growing like that. So along little bodies of water and these elevated grass tussocks was just very odd.
Here you can see the pretty typical habitat. So that mound of grass next to water, it was just really predictable at a point where we could get this species. Just a really handsome species. I might be biased though. And we weren't able to get any open flowers in the field. We had just either missed them by a day or just too early, just by a day or maybe even a few hours. But Fernando collected a few plants and planted them in this water bottle so that we could try to get one of these guys to flower for us, because none of the herbarium specimens were pressed with flowers. They were all in bud or without any kind of inflorescence at all. So it was really important for us to get some detailed photos of the floral characters as well as herbarium specimens that showed these floral characters for the first time.
Of Catangensis specifically. Yeah, all the other ones we saw open flowers, but Catangensis, we just seem to miss them every time.
Yeah. And so that worked. So we got these great photos of the open flowers for the first time. Nothing surprising or spectacular. They are identical to any of the other tropical stem forming Drosera in this group. So undivided styles, pink. And on the way back from that plateau, we found a species that Fernando and I were super excited to see. We had seen it on the way up from this plateau as well, but we didn't know how bad the road conditions were, so we didn't stop for very long. Fernando found this one while nearly peeing on them, and Drosera biquardii. So it had been photographed once before from Zambia by Miyamoto, a Japanese enthusiast.
Yeah, so this is the only one that we saw in the lowlands, right? I mean, unfortunately, the lowlands were very densely populated and lots of plantations. So it's very hard to find a habitat that was still good for carnivorous plants in the lowlands. So yeah, extremely excited to find this. And it was literally, we found it literally a pee stop. You know, look, can I stop here, side of the road? Quick pee. And yeah, you know, this looks a little interesting. Let's walk a little further this way. And there they were.
No, it's a really cool species. Stem forming, we found them pretty early in the season, so we didn't get to see the full extent of their stemminess, but it's a really unique species. It's not quite like any other of the stem forming species. Earlier in their growth, they're rosetted, so they looked identical almost to Drosera pilosa, but some of the later stage species were obviously stem forming. And one unique thing about this species that we're really excited to see, we weren't sure if it was an annual species or perennial, so regrowing from its dormancy. We knew that it, from herbarium specimens, that it flowers terminally, so that it goes dormant or dies after it flowers at the end of the wet season, usually May, June. But we were excited to see that some old stems, so the new plants growing from old stems, so starting this season. So we were able to confirm that they were in fact not annuals. They also had really fleshy, long roots. This was the typical habitat, so it's open savanna called a dambo. So yeah, that's it for the trip report. There's still some work to be done on this group of species. So particularly with Drosera catongensis, there's a group out of Penn State that wants to sequence this species to further investigate its taxonomy and its affiliation to the other members of this group. And we want to further distinguish it from the other species. So here's a photo of the stipules that are really interesting. Drosera catongensis consistently has these split stipules, whereas elongata and madagascariensis, you see these fused stipules. And a big priority for me is to establish this species in cultivation. So we were able to legally collect some material that has been growing really easily. And then in the future, I'd like to investigate the full distribution of Drosera catongensis. So as of right now, it's only known from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from a handful of plateaus. However, there are some specimens that I'm suspicious of. This one on the left is from Angola, and it shares a lot of the characteristics of the plants we saw. So I'd like to travel to Angola to verify the identity of those plants, as well as Burundi. So Burundi, north of these plants that we found, has some interesting specimens that share a lot of the characteristics of Drosera catongensis. Being one of the few Drosera species that are listed as critically endangered on the IUCN because of its limited distribution and because of a lot of the mining activities that are happening in a lot of its known habitat. It's important that we get to know its full distribution so that we can better conserve this species and make conservation assessments based on that. And then just some random picks. So we were lucky. We thought we were going to have to rough it this entire trip in our tents, but we got up to the plateau. There's almost no information online about any of these field stations or getting to these plateaus, but we got to the top of Kundalungu Plateau and they had, or at the top of Kabara Plateau and they had bunks for us, Wi-Fi. It was a huge treat. So this is us in our little chateau in the plateau here.
Very cold at night at some of these places. So some of you think of Africa tropical. So yeah, pretty not too warm during the day, right, Alex? I mean, even though it was summer, we're pretty high up at about 1,700 meters. Some of these places, but at night it got pretty cold.
Yeah, definitely highland plants up there as far as cultivation grows. And then just the airport. We were daydreaming about all the Utricularia and Genlissia that might be in the grasses of the airport, but didn't dare look. Typical road conditions are just sandy, terrible roads on these plateaus. We lucked out because they were a lot worse in my mind planning this trip, especially during the wet season.
Yeah, we got very lucky with the rain, right? I mean, I think it was just really one day that we were hiking out, we got some really strong rain. Otherwise, some little drizzles here and there, a lot of rain at night sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Taking advantage of Wi-Fi at this fancy infrastructure. So they're working really hard to revitalize a lot of these national parks. A lot of the tourism has never been fully developed, especially if they've lost a lot of these large mammals, but they're looking at other African countries that are able to attract tourists and get tourist dollars by conserving their own wildlife. And so the park is really focused on rebuilding infrastructure and eventually reintroducing some of those large animals into these parks. And the Forgotten Parks Foundation out of Frankfurt, Germany is the main international entity working with these parks. Our typical day, Fernando's infamous umbrella and dream team here. This is one of our drivers, one of the park rangers. In both parks, we were accompanied by armed guards. So just in the event of poachers or animals, even though we didn't really believe that there were any large animals there. And satellite imagery, which we were dependent on. The habitat was really sparse here as far as finding suitable seepages and open areas on these plateaus that we might find Drosera in. And so we were consulting a lot of satellite imagery.
That's where basically just following roads on Google Maps. And unfortunately, a lot of the places we wanted to go were mining concessions or other private property from the ex-president that, you know, they're just gates across the road all of a sudden and we weren't allowed through, or it was very bureaucratic to get through. And it's a very difficult place to travel. Congo was much safer than I thought it would be, but very bureaucratic, you know, to get all the permits that we needed, to go everywhere that we needed. And even sometimes, you know, we had to talk with the villagers and with locals and yeah, it's just very difficult to get in. Oh, even on the main roads, you know, there are a lot of checkpoints along the way where, you know, where there are COVID checkpoints or tolls where they would ask us for our documents. And yes, we ended up spending a lot of time, wasting a lot of time, unfortunately, in some of these.
And our guide Christian, who had arranged everything, super helpful. We wouldn't be able to do it without him. He knew who to bribe and like how to pay for the bribes as we traveled through all these areas and all these random roadblocks set up by random people on the road, all these unofficial stopping points. we're really dependent on him, especially since we didn't speak French with any kind of effectiveness.
Yeah, and when we say bribes, I think of more as tips. So because it's a very poor country
Yeah.
and you earn very low salaries, to me it's sort of like tipping in the US where you have to tip your hairdresser, your waiter, or whatever. It's the same thing there, but to a different level where everybody accepts a little tip to make things work smoother. And our guide really helped us navigate when to tip and how much to tip and whether we should just keep going and not even tip.
And then here with my favorite species of Drosera, Drosera catongensis.
Yeah, so look at the tall grasses they're growing among, just coming out of dormancy there. And how long do they get in the herbarium specimens, Alex? I don't remember.
Not very long, just about 20 centimeters the max. So they're shorter than Flexicollis for sure, but yeah, really cool habitat.
Flowerscapes though, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right, the flowerscapes are maybe about as long to get above the grasses.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And that was actually characteristic of all the species we saw there, right? Even the rosetted ones, the really long flowerscapes to get above the grasses.
Oh yeah, it was incredible. Yeah, so thanks for letting me share that trip report with you guys. And if you want to keep up with any of my other trip reports, or I'm about to leave again for Africa in 3 months here, so you can follow me on Instagram in search of species, or I maintain a photo gallery of the different Drosera species on insearchofspecies.com. I'm going to look through some of these questions in the chat.
So I see one. You want me to read them off to you? Would that be easier?
Looking where it starts here. Oh, somebody asked me what camera I used. I was using a Nikon D780, but I literally just traded it in because it was so bulky for this trip. I'm leaving for Africa again, and I'll be there for 6 to 10 months this time, and so I just traded it in for like a smaller mirrorless one that I think will be a lot less clumsy in the field. How much did this expedition cost? What was the rough breakdown? A lot of the cost was guides. So we were lucky enough on flights, because I've been planning this trip for about 2 years. Because of COVID or maybe something else, the flights were about $1,000 cheaper than they had been in the past. But the guide was a big chunk of change. I think we had to pay him.
Food is honestly one of the most expensive trips I've ever done.
I think I spent about $10,000 on my end for sure. It was yeah, a crazy crazy trip, but I'm working on a book of the African Drosera, and it's the last one that there's no photos of, so it's, I mean, you got to do it.
A lot of things in the DRC are cheap, if you're buying food along the road, for example, but hotels and supermarkets, if you want things that are Western standard, they're pretty pricey. I mean, everything is flown in, so it's almost like, living out in an island in the middle of the Pacific. I mean, unfortunately, they don't produce anything locally, a lot of the food items and stuff. So yeah, things were pretty pricey in the big city, Lubumbashi, especially where we were based a lot of times. We kept going in the field, coming back to Lubumbashi. But mostly the guide and the cars, I think, were some of the biggest expenses. But our guide, Christian, was totally worth it. Without him, we really wouldn't be able to have done much.
Mm-hmm. Somebody asked about permits. A couple of people asked about permits. Permits, especially in other countries, it's all about networking. So if I didn't have the cooperation of the university, and I had been fostering that relationship since 2018, so emailing back and forth with the professor there, I would never have been able to legally collect in that country, or especially in those parks. So really collaborating with local researchers and telling them about what you're trying to do, making sure they're benefiting from the arrangement as well. So we collected herbarium specimens for their collection as well, so that they could have recent, accurately identified specimens. And we collected some of their own study taxa as well. Really helped make that arrangement mutually beneficial. But yeah, the permits were not easy to get. It took forever. Even when we were there, we still had about 5 days of running around to different offices and introducing ourselves and signing papers and taking photo. It was, yeah, it was.
Permits, right? I mean, to get to the parks, to get through certain roads, and even then, like I was saying, there are certain private areas that we would get there all of a sudden, oh my gosh, there's a gate. Can we talk to the people? And it's just, oh, it's not possible to get the permit right now. You'd have to go back to Lubumbashi.
Yeah. Yeah. So permits were definitely one of the most stressful and intensive part of this trip.
Even on the way back, right? I mean, getting everything in legally, we had to go through customs and show the paperwork, and of course, customs agents are not really used to that sort of stuff. So, you know, the first ones are completely baffled by what we're showing them on their own website, and yeah.
What did the guides charge? I think it was about $250 a day, and we were there for 3 weeks, so it was a chunk of change there.
And of course, we had to tip the armed guards who would accompany us in the parks, or any other person who would accompany us along certain roads. Often a villager would have to come with us.
The car was separate and the driver was separate, so we had to pay. It was total $300 a day for the car and driver. Yeah, it was an expensive one. What is considered the wet season? So the wet season starts around December and ends around May, and then they start to enter the dry season. And so the dry season is cooler and drier up there on those plateaus, whereas the wet season is warmer and wetter.
Oh, and somebody's asking about the armed guards. Again, they kept saying that it was because of wild animals, but we didn't really think there were any wild animals there. I think they were just in it for the tips. But still, it was cool to walk around this guy holding this old, I don't know what model gun, but it looked like it was at least a few decades old.
Oh yeah, I mean, the picture of the guy with the gun and the sundew, like where else can you get that? It was awesome.
Although, it was a Kundalunga where there was a cemetery for, I think, 7 or 8 guards that had been killed about 15 years ago when some rebels attacked the park.
Yeah, but if there's no any other questions, thanks for coming. I'm glad so many people are interested in what I'm interested in.
Who the researcher is who's going to be doing the sequencing.
Oh, that's Tanya Renner and her colleagues out of Penn State. They have a new Center for Carnivorous and Parasitic Plants. And so a lot of cool research is coming out of there. They're doing a phylogeny on the genus Drosera. And so we're really happy to be able to provide some fresh material, especially of Catongensis, for which only the type specimens exist. And it's not really feasible to take a large amount of DNA from those plants.
Somebody's also asking, how did COVID make this trip more difficult? Geez, made it so both Alex and I had trouble on the way there, even though we had both gotten a COVID testing. There was just so much misinformation between, because we're flying through from the US to Germany to Ethiopia and then to the Congo. And there was an extra stop for me in, what's it called, Malawi? And I had an extra stop in the US. Oh yeah, Alex as well. And just every airport, you know, different people would interpret things different ways. Oh, you know, this country or this airline says it's X number of days, Y number of days. And that's where I got stuck for a night in Houston. I got stuck for a night in Frankfurt. And on top of that, I don't know if you guys remember, December was when that British train was first coming out. And so there was, people were freaking out at the Frankfurt airport. There were people quarantined in there. And so, you know, Christmas season in the middle of a pandemic with the new highly infectious strain going around, with nobody really knowing how to interpret the different regulations from different countries and airlines regarding the permits, it was a mess. And we had to get tested before leaving the Congo as well. That was an adventure in itself, right, Alex?
Yeah. trying to get the timing right because there's like 72 hours before you land. You have to have yeah. I hate that we had to do it during that trip, or during the pandemic, but with Congo, the political situation changes so frequently. I tried to do this trip originally in 2018, and then there was some political drama with an election that was happening, so it got pushed back. And so this COVID kind of provided a good opportunity to have some stability, maybe more so than usual. So that's just the timing, the way it worked out.
Yeah, I had 3 COVID tests before leaving or during the trip, the trip there, and then on the way back, we each had another one. And at several places along the roads in the Congo, they were asking us for our COVID tests, and of course, finding some way of getting an extra tip out of us if it wasn't according to their idea of how it should be. And I'm seeing somebody saying here that Tanya apparently gave a talk to you guys a few months ago, so you're familiar with her work. And she works with a few other people who I'm familiar with as well. They've been doing some genomic sequencing of carnivorous plants, some really exciting work, which we hope to see a lot of publications in the future. And somebody's asking, is anyone working on wetland or aquatic plants? I'm not sure specifically what they're talking about, but there's tons of people working on that, including carnivorous plants, right, in different places.
I think there was one other question up at the top about are the habitats allowed to burn regularly?
I don't think there's much control. At one park, I think they did mention that they burn it regularly, right, Alex? I don't remember if it was Upemba or Kundelungu.
Yeah. So at Upemba, they said they do controlled burns. And a lot of the burns happen naturally. And then unfortunately, a lot of the burns, or maybe fortunately, happen because of poaching. So people are trying to flush out small animals like rats or rabbits. So they burn the grasses in the dry season to try to corral those animals, I guess, out of the grasses. But those habitats are really fire adapted on the plateaus. So it doesn't, I don't think it has too much of an effect on the fire regime there.
Yeah, but the plants are well adapted to that sort of habitat. In my experiences in Brazil growing up and exploring tons of places, very similar savanna habitats, and the carnivorous plants that grow in these savanna habitats are, I mean, they're used to it. A lot of them just die down to the roots, like what we saw in the Congo. Although I did get the impression in the Congo that in the dry season there is specifically harsher than what I'd seen in Zambia, maybe other surrounding areas. We didn't see many of the annual species, and that might have just been because we're there early. But we saw a lot of habitats that looked really good, and they looked perfect for carnivorous plants, and yet nothing, or sometimes one little subulata flower. That was especially frustrating because in Zambia I'd seen such huge habitats with so many different species, with so many hundreds of plants of individuals of each species, and we didn't really see that in the Congo, and we're not really sure why. But my running hypothesis is just that dry seasons there are much harsher.
How rare are Drosera outside of the protected areas? So the plateaus are really huge. The park covers a small area of the plateau. Unfortunately, the rest of the plateau is a private concession. So we have no idea about the abundance of the Drosera there. There are herbarium specimens from the other parts of the plateaus. So we know that Katongensis does exist there, but it's, I guess, up for the future to decide how developed those other parts of the plateaus get, because they do have mining rights and agricultural rights to those parts of the plateaus.
And somebody's asking how upfront people were about the tips. It varied a lot. Some people were very upfront about it. Some people, they didn't even ask for it, but our guy thought, let's just give them a little tip so that they won't cause us problems. Because, for example, one thing he said a few times, these villagers, they can maybe call somebody further ahead who could give us trouble if we don't leave them a little tip. But some of them were really, really obvious. I mean, our exits from the country through the airport, which took a few hours, most maddening, chaotic experience I've ever been through. And there were several people at that airport that we had to tip, and including the lady stamping our passport. I mean, she was just, I forget what she was saying, but she was saying like, Coca-Cola or something, the
Yeah.
drink
I need money for a Coke. That's what she said.
Or
Yeah.
coffee or something, and holding on to my passport, of course, while saying this and pretending she's leafing through it. And
yeah, it's something you expect and budget for when you go to places like this, for sure.
A very interesting experience. It definitely felt sometimes like I was on another planet, but everybody's so nice. People were so incredibly nice. And as I was saying before, much safer than I expected, right? I mean, we often hear of the Congo being one of the most dangerous places in the world, but it's a huge country. It's larger than Mexico. So yeah, the northeastern parts of the country, maybe there's some guerrilla warfare going on right now, but safety-wise, I mean, that car accident that we had in that dirt road where the villagers were helping move everything out of the car. I mean, maybe a few cans of food disappeared, we're not sure, but they were, helping us move everything out of the car, electronics, and they were so respectful. I remember at the end giving them some water, and they were literally like waiting for me to hand the bottles instead of like rushing. I had tons of water bottles around me. They were just extremely honest, very, very nice people. And I actually felt safer there in some ways than in lots of parts of Latin America that I travel. So that was quite a surprise. And yeah, with the French, we could sometimes understand what was going on with some of the villagers or our guides. In fact, everybody there speaks at least 2 or 3 languages. Our guide, not only the French and Swahili, which are the generic languages there, but he also had English, of course, and then he had 2 or 3 other local languages that he spoke. It's amazing. Oh, and one other comment regarding Utricularia reflexa that Alex mentioned, it's one of my favorites. We didn't see any really large ones, but some of the really large specimens in Africa, the traps are so large, and they're usually like sitting on the surface of like a thin film of water over soil in seepages. And you can literally play with the traps, like grab a blade of grass and trigger it and see it working, almost like a Venus flytrap. It's really amazing. I don't think I see any other questions, but anybody have any questions about any of the species we saw, any of the habitats, any other experiences we had there?
Where to next? So I leave for South Africa in July, and I'll be there off and on 6 to 10 months. There's a few other countries I'm trying to hit while I'm over there to just wrap up what I need for this book that I'm writing. But yeah, hopefully Madagascar if I'm lucky. I'd love to get to Tanzania, Zambia, and if I'm super lucky, Angola. I would love to see if Katongensis is there, which I suspect that it is.
Don't forget to invite me to that part. Big problem with Angola, of course, all the landmines still there from the civil wars in the 80s and 90s.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I'm sure with a good guide, we'd be able to get around. And of course, they speak Portuguese there, which for me would make things a lot easier.
There's also an allegedly extinct Utricularia that I'd love to find, Utricularia potidana, out of Mozambique and Malawi. And I plan on driving pretty close to there, so it might be too tempting not to go look for.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. Thank you for answering all of our questions and sharing all your beautiful photos and all your research. We really appreciate you taking the time to come here and talk to us about all you've been up to. It's very exciting, especially now when most of us haven't left our house in a year. So
thanks for having us. I love sharing.
Hope you guys enjoyed it.
Thank you. And then if you wouldn't mind giving me the host control.
Totally.
Because we will move on to our raffle and then wrap up our meeting.
Okay, done.
Thank you. Okay. So, can you guys see this list of names? Yep. Okay. So everybody who RSVP'd got one entry into our raffle, and then everybody who is a member got a second entry. And we're raffling off 2 sets of 6 rhizomes. So whoever the winners are, we will contact you to make sure we have the correct mailing address and send them your way. And the rhizomes were generously donated by Carnivorous Plant Nursery. So if you don't win and you really want plants, definitely recommend checking them out. And one added bonus of being a member is you get 10% off there. So, you know, if you're not a member yet, and you want to go get some plants, definitely recommend doing that. So just let me make sure I have the right numbers. 35 people. All right. So we got 16, who is Joe. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, Eugnalis. So if you're here, please speak up, say something in the chat. I'm not sure if I can pull up the chat at the same time. So hopefully somebody else can keep an eye on that for me.
It doesn't look like he's in.
Okay. Let's like give it another minute just in case. And then if he doesn't say something, we'll run it again.
We can do the second one then.
Yeah, we'll do the second one. All right. So we got 9, who is Dylan Manfredi. Dylan Manfredi.
We don't have any Dylans in the list either.
All right. Let's try again. Number 20. So that is John Hollister.
I think John Hollister's in there twice. And so is Joe Williams. Oh, because of the members.
Yeah, because they're members.
I understand. John's here. I know that.
Oh, okay. John's here. Awesome. Congratulations, John. We will be in touch with you, make sure we have your right address, and then let's run it again to get our second person. 33. So that's gonna be Tyler. Pretty sure Tyler's here. Tyler Wilt.
Yep, he's here.
Awesome. Cool. Congratulations. We will be in touch with you and send your rhizomes out. Again, thank you so much to Carnivorous Plant Nursery for donating these to us. We really appreciate that.
All right, thanks Blake for that, and thank you to Alexander and Francesca for the meeting. That was awesome. So with that, thank you all of you for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.